Welcome to another episode of Touching Lives with Dr. James Merritt. I'm your host, Alex Sasser, and Dr. Merritt is just about ready to begin today's message. We are in a great series on the life of David, and to help you follow along with every message, we have a free downloadable booklet for you. Go to touchinglives.org to download your copy right now. Also, we have a special gift available for those willing to support this ministry with an electronic recurring gift of $50 or more. To learn more, go to touchinglives.org and look for the information about the Touching Lives Partner Coin by looking for the icon that shows the coin. Also, you can always call our Help Center at 800-413-1131 with any questions with prayer needs or to order any materials such as books by Dr. Merritt or CDs and DVDs of his messages. Thank you for joining us today, and now here's today's sermon from Dr. James Merritt.
Well, good morning. I want to thank you for being here. Those who are watching online, those are our campus at Mill Creek, those who are watching by TV. Appreciate you being here today, and I want to begin by telling you about the greatest boxer that most people say ever lived. His name was Muhammad Ali, and you probably saw him fight. I saw him fight. And the thing about Muhammad Ali was he didn't just fight with skill, though he was very skillful. He fought with passion. And one of the things he said was that he felt made him successful was before he would fight, back in the dressing room, he would think of reasons why he ought to be angry with his opponent and why he ought to just really be furious with his opponent. And in his autobiography, he said something that may reveal why he really was such a great fighter. He said, "I'm a fighter. I believe in the eye for an eye business. I'm no cheek turner. I got no respect for a man who won't hit back. If you kill my dog, you better hide your cat." Now, what that great boxer was expressing is what I call the revenge factor. And we were all born with that factor. We were all born with this innate attitude that says, you hit me, I hit you back. You do me wrong, I do you wrong. You mess with me, I mess with you. It's the temptation we all face. In fact, I'm going to tell you a story. I'm embarrassed to tell you. I've never told it before, but it's just embarrassing. I got one spanking when I was in school, one. And what's embarrassing is I was a sophomore in high school when I got my spanking. Now, let me tell you what happened. I was in algebra class. My teacher's name was Mrs. Savage, which was a very fitting name for her. And she was my algebra teacher. And what Mrs. Savage would do is she'd take the first part of the class and she'd teach the lesson. And then she would give you the second half of the class and she'd give you the homework that you had to do for the next day. And if you were fast enough and quick enough, you could do your homework in the class and not have to take it home with you. And I never did like to take homework home. So I was busily working all the problems, and I'd gotten to the very last problem and had just about finished the problem when Steve, a friend of mine, got up and went to the pencil sharpener, and he was walking by me. He took his pencil and ran it right up the middle of my paper and ruined the whole page, meaning I had to go home and do it because you couldn't turn in a page like that. I had to go home and do it over. And, he was laughing. He thought it was real cool that he did that. Well, I wasn't real happy about it. I was really kind of upset. So I waited till he sat down, and I waited for a couple of minutes. Then I got up, and I went to the pencil sharpener, and I did the same thing to him he did to me. I took my pencil, and I ran it right up the middle of his page. Well, I was so consumed with getting my revenge, I didn't notice Mrs. Savage was watching me. And as soon as I did that, she said, "Mr. Merritt, would you come to the front of the class?" And I went up to the front of the class, and she said, "I want to know what you did to his homework." And of course, I told her what he did, and of course he's grinning like a Cheshire cat, the whole thing. And so her husband, Mr. Savage, and it was a marriage made in heaven. Mr. Savage was the designated spanker of the school. He was the guy that was charged to spank all the kids that got in trouble. And I think the reason why he was a designated spanker is because he really enjoyed it. So he was right across the room. He was teaching algebra as well. She walked across the room. "I need to see you." Came out. He kind of looked surprised. So she told me what he did. Said he needs a spanking. So here I am like a criminal, hands against the wall, bent over, and Mr. Savage made sure that everybody heard the punishment that I was getting that day. And as you guys all know that's played football, it's always the second guy that gets caught, right? So I got caught. So what happened was, in effect, Steve got my dog, I got his cat, and the savages brought up the rear. So that's the revenge factor. And we're all susceptible to it. Even one of the greatest kings that ever lived, a man by the name of David, had to fight the temptation to exercise the revenge factor. If you're a guest of ours today, we're in a series on a man by the name of David. And the reason why we're taking about 9 weeks to study his life is because more scripture is given over to David than anybody else in the Bible except Jesus. And when you realize that, it kind of stands to reason. Evidently, God wants us to study this man's life. He says so much about him, and there's so many lessons we can learn about him. And today, we're going to look at what I believe may be David's finest hour of everything that David ever did. Now, that may surprise you, because if you know anything about the story of David, and I were to ask you when you'd walked into our building this morning, hey, what do you think is the greatest victory that David ever won? What was his greatest accomplishment? Most of you would say, oh, that's easy. I believe it was when David defeated Goliath. And I would have said that for a long time myself until I studied the passage we're going to look at today. And now I beg to differ. If you brought a copy of God's Word, I want you to look with me. It's kind of a funny story. It's in a book called 1 Samuel chapter 24. It's real easy to find. You just go all the way back to Genesis, start going right, turn about 6 or 8 books, and you'll hit 1 Samuel chapter 24. Now, let me just kind of set up what's going on. I believe that David's greatest victory was not won on a battlefield. It was actually won in a cave. And it wasn't a giant he was facing on the outside. It was a giant he was facing on the inside. Because David in this story is facing a giant that was far bigger and far stronger and far more powerful and far more deadly than Goliath ever thought about being. And it was a giant called revenge. And by the way, if you're here today and you got somebody in mind right now that you're bitter toward, somebody you'd like to get even with, somebody that did you wrong, that if they were to step out on a curb right now and get hit by a bus, you wouldn't shed a tear. You know who I'm talking? Somebody right now, you say, oh yeah, I've got that person in mind. I really want you to hear what I'm going to say in the next few minutes. Because you see, fighting Goliath took David stepping up. Fighting revenge took David stepping down. When you fight Goliath, it takes guts. When you fight revenge, it takes grace. When you fight Goliath, it takes might. When you fight revenge, it takes mercy. And the story that unfolds that we're about to read is really a story you wouldn't expect to read, because if you go back just a few chapters, David has just killed the giant Goliath. And you would think that because David had killed the giant that nobody else would even fight, you would think that there would have been parades, there would have been rewards, there would have been medals, there would have been promotions, there would have been accolades. You would think that David would have been on easy street, but instead, after he kills Goliath, the next 10 years of his life are sheer hell. Why? Well, remember, David has slayed the enemy. He's won the Medal of Honor. He is the MVP of the Israeli army. He's won the Nobel Peace Prize. He's the heavyweight champion of the world. He's become an overnight celebrity. His popularity, however, although it's soaring off the charts, it's become a poison called jealousy to a man named Saul, who was the king. He couldn't stand it. Everybody wanted David's autograph. Nobody wanted Saul. Everybody wanted to touch David. Nobody wanted to touch Saul. David was everybody's hero. Saul was everybody's zero. And David's star was rising while Saul's sun was setting. And so, blinded by hatred and burning with jealousy, Saul becomes consumed with one thing. I am taking David out. If I don't do anything else as king, I am going to kill David. It is the #1 goal of my life. Now, how all this is set up is really fascinating. right after David kills Goliath, Saul is very grateful, and so he invites David to come to the palace to be his musician, his chief musician. David played the harp. And Saul was under a lot of stress as a king, and when David would play the harp, it would soothe Saul's feelings. It would make Saul feel good. But he just could not stand it after a while. Every time he saw David, he just got consumed with rage and jealousy. And the scripture says that one day, David was playing the harp, just minding his own business, and Saul takes a spear and throws it at David, trying to kill him, and he misses David. It hits behind the wall, which, by the way, a word to anybody out there that's a musician, or you think you're a musician, if you're ever playing a musical instrument and somebody throws a spear at you, you better get another job. That's just kind of a thought for you. But anyhow, he tries to kill David. That doesn't work. Then Saul found out that his daughter Michal had fallen in love with David. And David had fallen in love with Michal. And David wanted to marry Michal. So he goes to ask for her hand in marriage, and Saul does something that's kind of strange. He says, David, I will give you my daughter's hand in marriage under one condition. You ready for this? That's why you ought to read the Bible. It's fascinating. You have to bring me 100 Philistine foreskins. Now, what you do with foreskins, I don't know. The Bible doesn't say, okay? But he says, if you want to marry her, you've got to bring 100 Philistine foreskins. And you say, why in the world would he want? He didn't want the foreskins. He's thinking is, surely out of 100 Philistines, one of them can take this guy out. Well, David doubles down and brings him 200 foreskins and marries his daughter. All right, Saul says, okay, that didn't work. So then Saul brings out the Navy SEALs. He brings out the Green Berets. He brings out the Army Rangers. He gets a hit squad of his best soldiers, and he says, I want you to go assassinate David. I'm going to give you his home address. I want you to go at night. I want you to kill him while he's in bed. But Michal, his wife, finds out about the plot. She warns David, and David escapes, and he gets away. Now Saul is so hot. He's so angry. He says, you know what? If you want a job done right, do it yourself. So Saul gets his entire army together, and he says, we're going to kill David. So we begin reading in verse 1. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. Now, if you ever get to go to Israel with me, I'm going next year, by the way, we'll go to this place called En-Gedi. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. It's got a hike to get there, but it's beautiful springs. It's got a beautiful pond, and there are all kinds of caves there, and this takes place in a cave. Now, what you're about to read is David has Saul for the first time red-handed. He can kill Saul, he can end his ministry, he can begin his ministry as king, and he can sleep in peace for the first time in 10 years. He had his chance for revenge, but he didn't take it. And neither should we. And you're going to see three things that David did in this passage that we have to do if we're going to defeat the power of revenge and bitterness in our life. Number one, you honor the principle of integrity. You honor the principle of integrity. Now, the story begins with, frankly, a kind of an embarrassingly funny scene, and there's no other way to put it, so I'll just read it to you. Saul came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there. And Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. Now, there's really no polished way to put this. I mean, I wish there was, but what's happening is Saul feels the call of nature. And as my grandson loves to say, my grandson Connor, he had to go to the potty, okay? So I know, when I first read this many, many years ago, I thought to myself, okay, what does it mean when it says he had to go relieve himself? Well, when we go to the bathroom, as we all know, we only have one of two choices. So I tried to think, how do I put this to my people in the nicest way I can? Let's just say he was behind curtain number 2, all right? So Saul goes into this cave, and the reason why I know this is because what David's about to pull off, he would have never been able to pull off if he was behind curtain number one. So the good news is that Saul is doing something that thankfully I don't think is hardly mentioned anywhere else in the Bible, so I hope I never have to talk about it again. Anyway, Saul has gone to the cave, he's taken off his clothes, he's taken off his armor, and while he's attending to his business, he doesn't realize that David's in the stall right next to him. He doesn't know that. And here's David's chance. Here's the man that's been on his tail for 10 years. And now David is literally on his tail. So what's he going to do? Because if the situation were reversed, we all know what Saul would have done to David, and David's men knew it. So the men said, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. They said, David, here's your chance. God's delivered Saul right into your hands. He is in the most vulnerable position that any man could ever be in. This can be over just like that. You can end our misery. You can end your misery. You can be king, and we can go to sleep for the first time at night and sleep like a baby. And you fully expect David to run his sword right through Saul's backside. But he doesn't. He does this. Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of his robe. Well, David, why didn't you kill him? He deserved it. He asked for it. Nobody would have blamed you. Everybody that knows the story would have said, David, you did the right thing. He had it coming to him. But instead, all David does is just cut off a little piece of the robe. And how does that affect David? Listen to this. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. Now, why is David so bothered? Why is he so upset? Why is he feeling guilty? I mean, he had the chance to kill him and he didn't. So, David, why are you feeling guilty about sparing the man's life? Listen to verse 8. Then David went out of the cave. Evidently, Saul's done his business. Saul's gone back out. He didn't know David was in there. David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, my Lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. You see, the fact is, Saul is still on the throne. By the way, in this story, more ways than one. Saul is still on the throne. Now, he may not be the king he needs to be. He may not be the king he should be. He may not be the king that God wanted him to be, but he's still the king. That fact has not changed, and he is still David's king. There's an old saying that the customer may not always be right, but the customer is still the customer. Well, the king may not always be right, but the king is still the king. And David understands that, and David knows that. Now, why is that important? Because of what he says in verse 6. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. See, David knew it's against God's law to kill the king. That's something God made plain from the very beginning. When God set up the kingdom for the nation of Israel, he said, okay, one thing you cannot do, you cannot kill the king. You do not dishonor the king, you do not disrespect the king, and you do not murder the king. So when you're facing a choice of action in any situation, you can always know what to do by asking the question that David asked himself. And here's the question. What is the right thing to do? Now get that picture. All of his men, they're tired, they're exhausted, they love David, they fought with David, but they're sick and tired of this despotic king. They're sick and tired of being on the run. They want to go back to their families. This is their chance to finally end their nightmare once and for all, and David doesn't do it. Because David was a man of integrity. And integrity is always doing the right thing. So here's what David's men were doing. They were doing what we would do. They were weighing their options, looking at the pros, looking at the cons, looking at their circumstances. They were following their instincts. They were thinking, you know what, this is really what we ought to do. This is our shot. But they weren't asking one question. What's the right thing to do? Not what is the convenient thing to do. Not what is the best thing to do for me and my welfare. What is the right thing to do? See, what set David apart from his men was that he understood that what's right in any situation is not what we think is right. It's not what we feel is right. It's what God says is right. And David says, I got to do the right thing. And by the way, I don't care how great the opportunity is that comes along in your life. If you have to violate your conscience or you have to violate God's word, it's not the right opportunity. So, if you don't listen to anything else I say, I want you to listen. I'm going to make this one worth coming for. There are 3 roads you're always going to take in your dealings with other people. Always. You have to take one of them, and you will take one of them. I call one the low road. I call one the middle road. I call one the high road. Now, the low road, I call the low road, that's the satanic level. That's when you return evil for good. And I know most of us would say, well, I don't ever want to be on the low road. I don't ever try to do evil for good. If nobody's done evil to me, I don't go out of my way to do evil for them, you know, and I get that. We all try to stay off the low road. But then there is the middle road, and I call that the sensible level. That's when you return evil for evil, right? And let's face it, that's the road that makes sense. It sounds logical. You know, you do evil, I do evil. You hit me, I hit you. It's like 2 little boys that got into a fight at school, and the teacher separated them and brought them in and set them down. And she said, okay, I want to know what happened. And one little boy said, well, it all started when he hit me back. And that's kind of how we are, right? You know, you don't hit me, I won't hit you, but you hit me back, I'm going to hit you back even harder. And let's face it, that sounds sensible, right? You do me wrong, I do you wrong. You hit me, I hit you. You mess with me, I mess with you. That sounds sensible. But then there's the high road. And I call that the supreme level. That's when you return good for evil. And Saul even admitted this in verse 17, because listen to what he says to David. He said, you're more righteous than I. You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. In other words, here's what Saul said. You didn't do to me what I would have done to you. And you did for me what I would not have done for you. David took the high road. Now, one of my favorite things I've ever said to anybody is this: always take the high road, there's very little traffic on it. A lot of traffic on the middle road, some traffic on the low road, not a lot of traffic on the high road. Take the high road. In other words, be a person of integrity. Do the right thing. Honor the principle of integrity. Now, the next one is going to sound like I'm trying to make a political point, and I'm not. I don't do that anymore. But it does have implications for the political atmosphere that we're in. Number 2, you honor the position of authority. You honor the position of authority. Now, there's another thing that kept David from taking revenge against Saul, because notice how he addresses Saul. He says this to Saul 4 times. My master, he calls him the Lord's anointed, the anointed of the Lord. My Lord, the King of Israel. Now notice, he never refers to the person of Saul, he refers to the position of Saul. The Marine Corps has a saying, you don't salute the person, you salute the rank. You don't salute the person, you salute the rank. In other words, you may not feel like you can honor the person, but you do honor the position. Now, frankly, I had to learn that lesson myself many, many years ago. I was pastoring my former church, and it was back when Bill Clinton was president and the whole Monica Lewinsky situation had blown up. And I was talking about it one Sunday, and I'll just say that I said something about the president I shouldn't have said. I said something about the president that was very disrespectful. And it was one of those moments, I knew the moment I said it, I shouldn't have said it. I knew it. I knew the moment I said it, I shouldn't have said it. So it bothered me all week. So the next Sunday, before I began my sermon, I got up, and I'm going to tell you, this is exactly what I said to my church. I said, folks, before I get up and preach, I need to say something to you. I said something last week that was completely and totally wrong, out of line, and inappropriate. I said something about the president I should not have said. He is the president, and his office deserves our highest respect, especially respect from a pastor. So I ask your forgiveness, and I will double my effort to pray for the president. So I've been where you are. I've been guilty, and so I'm just going to kind of just chase a rabbit just about this far, okay, just this far. I don't care whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or an independent. I don't care whether you lean to the right or you lean to the left. I don't even care really right now where you are in all this debate that's going up in Washington about all the stuff that's going on. If anybody else is not going to do it, we who are the people of God need to get back to treating others with respect and with civility and with kindness. Name calling is not going to get us anywhere. Questioning people's motives are not going to get us anywhere. And I'm speaking to everybody. So I'm just letting you, I'm speaking to, to both parties, both houses, from the president right on down. You don't have to agree with me. I don't have to agree with you. But as a Christian and as a follower of Jesus, I need to respect you. You need to respect me. We need to be civil. We don't need to be calling others names. We don't need to be questioning other people's motives. And oh, by the way, let me just say this to you while we're in the neighborhood. I said this to my boys the other day. Wherever you are on this whole, I'm just going to kind of, again, this far. Wherever you are on the Kavanaugh and the Ford situation, wherever you are, that's between you and the Lord, that's fine. How many people are praying for Dr. Ford? How many people are praying for Judge Kavanaugh? How many people are praying for the Democratic senators? How many people are praying for the Republican senators? How many people are praying for truth to win out? That's what we ought to be doing. That's what God has called us to do. So the point that I'm making is we need to get back to where we simply respect the position of authority. One of our founding fathers, the second president of the United States, John Adams, was writing to someone who was worried about the beginning of the nation and what kind of a future that might be in store. And they were really worried whether or not we could really hold this thing together called the Republic. John Adams also was very fearful and very worried and very concerned about the danger that we face if we could even hold this country together or not. Now I want you to listen to what John Adams wrote. He said, "There is one thing, my dear sir, that must be attempted and most sacredly observed, or we are all undone. There must be decency and respect and veneration introduced for persons of authority of every rank, or we are undone. In a popular government, this is our only way." One of the marks of maturity is the willingness to get under authority, even though you may not like that authority. You may not agree with the way that authority always acts. Because look, David knew, Saul, you're not acting like a king. You don't talk like a king. You're not conducting yourself like a king. But you're still the king. And I am still under your authority. Now let me just stop right there, because I'm not saying something you may think I'm saying. That does not mean we give in to wickedness. It does not mean that we speak truth even to people at the highest places of authority. It doesn't mean that we don't respectfully call out anyone who's not acting the way they ought to act or doing what they ought to do. Nobody gets a mulligan on doing wrong or acting wrong, not even a king or a president or a senator or a congressman. But there's a way we can do that in a respectful way, in a civil way, where we can attack the action and not the actor. Where we can attack the misdeeds and misconducts of the ruler without attacking the ruler. And so, don't take my word for it. This is a man who would be king. This is a man who knew he was going to be the king. But this was a man who was not yet the king. And he said, I'm going to honor the position of authority. Why? It's the right thing to do. So you honor the principle of integrity. What's the right thing? You honor the position of authority. Now, if you thought that was tough, here's the last one, and this is the toughest one of all. You ready? You honor the power of humility. Now, let me show you what I mean. You talk about going the second mile and the third mile and the fourth mile. Not only does David not kill Saul when he had the chance, not only does he feel guilty just because he cut off a piece of his robe, he does the unthinkable. Because remember, at first it was Saul who was in that very vulnerable position. Well, now David voluntarily, on his own, puts himself in an even more vulnerable position. Now look what David does. Then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, "My lord the king." When Saul looked behind him, this is amazing to me. David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. Now, don't you get the picture? David goes out to the king, who's been on his tail for 10 years, who has wanted dead, forget alive posters all over the kingdom. And David, unbelievably, on his own, voluntarily, he bows down as if that were not enough. He lays down as if that were not enough, and then he puts his face to the ground. Can you say vulnerable? A soldier cannot put himself in a more vulnerable position than David just did. He bows down, and what he was basically saying to Saul, okay, buddy, you've been after me for 10 years. This is what you want? Have at it. Take your best shot. I'm not going to fight back. I had you in my sights. I'm not going to kill you. I'm not going to do the devil's work for him. You do your best to me. Saul now could do to David what David would not do to Saul. The question is, why is David doing that? Why is David humbling himself before a man who is so obviously out of the will of God, who is so obviously far away from God, who is acting unlike a king as any king has ever lived who's ever been king? We'll go back again one more time and let's read verse 6. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." Now listen carefully. Here's what David was saying. It was God who anointed Saul. It was God who appointed Saul. It was God that put him on the throne. And what David was doing, this is so important, David was just not honoring the position of his authority. David was honoring the power behind his authority. He wasn't mainly honoring Saul, he was honoring his position. He was honoring God. He wasn't just bowing down to Israel's king, he was bowing down to the king of Israel's king. Because let me tell you something that's true about every ruler on this planet, whether he's a dictator, whether he's a king, whether he's a president, whether he's a prime minister, whether he's a sultan, it doesn't matter what he is or what his title is. Behind every power is the power of God. He's the one that puts one up. He's the one that sets one down. And as a great communicator put it, you do not replace what God has in place. You do not replace what God has put in place. You do not dethrone what God has enthroned. And David was humbling himself under God, because here's what David finally figured out about Saul. If you put him in, you can take him out. If you set him there, you can take him from there. Now, let me make sure you don't understand something, because I know some may be thinking. What we're dealing here, got to keep this in context, we're dealing with personal revenge, 101. We're dealing with a man who's wanted to kill somebody else who has done nothing to him at all. A man who's trying to return evil for good. We're not dealing with someone like Adolf Hitler. We're not dealing with someone who doesn't just have a vendetta against one person, but a person's on an evil, political, spiritual vendetta to wipe out entire races of people and subjugate an entire world. But the spirit of humility that David had is found in the most important thing he said in the whole passage. Listen to this. May the Lord be our judge. Now he's talking to Saul. He's still on his face talking to Saul. May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May he consider my cause and uphold it. In other words, what he said, I don't know what you're about to do to me, but whatever you're going to do, may he vindicate me by delivering me from your hand. May he deliver me, but may he vindicate me by delivering me from your hand. Now listen. When you make up your mind, I'm going to return evil for evil. You got me, I'm going to get you back. You mess me over, when I get the shot, I'm going to mess you over. When you return evil for evil, you take matters into your own hands. But you can return good for evil if you'll turn matters into God's hands. If you'll trust the matter into God's hands. See, pride is when you take matters into your own hands. Humility is when you trust matters into God's hands. Listen, let me tell you, I got some bad news for you. If you ever get even with somebody, you didn't get even. You got behind. Because when somebody does you wrong, they're on this level. And you're on this level. And the moment you decide, I'm going to get even with you, you just brought yourself down to their level. And see, that's exactly what was going on here. Our job's not to get even with anybody who does us wrong. It's to stay ahead of them. And by the way, even Saul realized that's exactly what David did. Because go back and listen to this. He said, David, you're more righteous than I. He said, you've treated me well, but I've treated you badly. You have just now told me about the good you did to me. The Lord delivered me into your hands, but you did not kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him get away unharmed? Well, may the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. I know that you will surely be king and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. You know what Saul just said to David? Saul said, David, I spent 10 years of my life trying to drag you down to my level. And now I finally realize I need to be brought up to your level. The central lesson to learn about the revenge factor is this, okay? Here's the central lesson. Someone may choose to be your enemy, but you don't have to choose to be their enemy. And by the way, pastors make enemies. You know, Jesus said, woe be unto you if all men speak well of you. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm in good company. Because I can tell you, I was talking to one of my best buddies out there that has been with me for 30 years. If you want a list of people that don't like me, I got a few. I know where they live. I know their names. I know their numbers. Teresa knows some of them I'm talking about. I know what it's like to be stabbed in the back. I know what it's like to have your motives questioned. I know what it's like to have people say you're in it for this or in it for that, in it for the fame, in it for this, in it for that. I've been there, done that. I've got my share of anonymous letters, and by the way, I've never got a good one. I think I've told you before, I'm like Dwight L. Moody. You know, Dwight L. Moody got an anonymous letter in the mail one time. All it had was the word fool written on it. That's all, just the word fool. That's all I had. He got up in the pulpit the next Sunday. He said, I got the weirdest letter I've ever gotten in my life. Somebody signed it and forgot to write it. I've got my share of enemies. Saul said to David, you are my enemy. David said to Saul, you're not mine. I cannot choose whether or not you make me your enemy. I can choose whether or not I make you my enemy. See, this is a story about a man who's being treated like a criminal, but he acted like a king. And it's the story of a man who acted, who was the king, but he acted like a criminal. And the whole point of the story was not what David could have done to Saul. The story is all about what David did for God. You know, I've often, as I close this up, when you talk about humility, humility is one of the toughest things in the world to even talk about, right? I mean, think about it. Suppose one of you were to come, Harvey, suppose you were to come up to me and you say, Pastor, are you a humble guy? Well, how do you answer that? Well, sure, Harvey, can't you tell? You know, I mean, hey, how do you, it's like a slippery, it's like a greased pig. You can't get a handle around it. Heard about a guy that was voted in church the most humble man in the church. They gave him a badge to wear. He wore it the next Sunday. They took it away from him. I mean, what are you going to do? So I was trying to think, well, how do you get your hand, I didn't even talk about humility. Hit me like a ton of bricks. I read this story. You ready? Humility is taking yourself out of the way so God can get in the way. Humility is taking yourself out of the way so that God can get in the way. But here's my favorite part of this story. Because I'm trying to teach you this. I hope you get it every week. I have people tell me all the time, it's just a hard book to understand. That's a big book, long book, so it's just so hard to understand. It really isn't. There's parts of it that are, yeah. As a whole, it's really not. Because all of this book is about one thing. It's all about Jesus. From Genesis to Revelation, it's all about Jesus. If you just keep that in mind, He's the golden key that unlocks the whole thing. It's all about Jesus. So you think about what we said about David today, and just think about it. What we said about David was true on steroids about Jesus. For example, Jesus always did the right thing. He honored the principle of integrity. Jesus always did the will of His Heavenly Father. He honored the position of authority. And even at the cross, when He deserved and could have taken revenge and had the right to take revenge, He didn't do it. He said, Father, forgive them. I don't care what they do to me. I choose to forgive them. He honored the power of humility. And if that Jesus lives in you, and if that Jesus lives in me, the revenge factor can never become a factor in our life.
We are so glad you tuned in here on the Touching Lives digital channel, and we hope you enjoyed the sermon today. Be sure to click and follow this page, and feel free to leave any comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts from today's message. Look for a new episode to be posted on this channel each Sunday. In the meantime, check out our free resources at touchinglives.org, and be sure to sign up today for our annual Mountaintop Conference. All the information about this exciting conference can be found at mountaintopconference.com. Thank you so much for watching today. I'll see you right here next time for another episode of Touching Lives with Dr. James Merritt.
Touching Lives, teaching people everywhere who Jesus is and why they need Him. This program is sponsored by Touching Lives Ministries and is made possible by the grace of God and your faithful prayers and gifts.